Welcome, traveler, wherever in the world you may be tonight, from a quiet apartment in the city to a small cottage near the woods, or a room filled with the hush of midnight. I'm so glad you've joined us here. Before we begin, if you'd like to share where you're listening from, I'd love to hear. It's a quiet joy to know how many peaceful hearts are resting together, even across oceans and time zones. And if this kind of story brings you comfort, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Morpheus by Starlight is a place to return to whenever you need stillness, softness, or a gentle voice to guide you into sleep. Now, settle in. Let the world grow distant. Let your breathing slow. And come with me to a misty kingdom nestled among the Bavarian Alps, where candlelight flickered across endless halls of mirrors, and a young king dreamed of a world more beautiful than the one he was born into. This is the story of Ludwig of Bavaria, the Fairytale King, who vanished into his own story. Long before he became a king, before the towers of Neuschwanstein rose like a dream etched in stone, Ludwig was simply a quiet boy, growing up in the hush of the Bavarian mountains and in the company of silence. He was born on a warm August afternoon in 1845 in Nymphenburg Palace, a stately but unremarkable castle just west of Munich. The rooms were vast and formal, their ceilings painted with allegories, their halls echoing with polished footsteps and the gentle rustle of silk gowns. Outside, gardens unfolded in rigid symmetry, fountains sang their rehearsed songs, and rows of hedges stood trimmed like soldiers. But for all its elegance, the palace felt like a cage made of ceremony. The grand city of Munich, with its markets and its music, its carriages and candlelit theatres, was close enough to see but far from Ludwig's heart. He did not crave its applause or excitement. Even as a child, he seemed drawn towards something else, something older, deeper, quieter. It was to the south his thoughts drifted, past the orchards and farms, beyond the orderly lines of trees that lined the roads, to the mountains that rose in whispers and shadows. There, where the earth lifted toward the sky in ridges of stone and green, was Neuschwanstein, his family's summer retreat, nestled among emerald hills and ancient rock, where the air was thinner, cooler, and filled with the scent of pine and possibility. To Ludwig, Neuschwanstein was not just a place. It was a threshold. The castle stood above two glacial lakes, their surfaces so still they reflected not only the sky, but the mood of the mountains. In the early mornings, mists rose from the water in slow, coiling tendrils, as if the earth were exhaling a dream. The forests beyond shifted with wind and light. Noises were gentle, far between. The call of a raven, the creak of a tree trunk, the distant toll of a chapel bell swallowed by clouds. It was here, in this hidden cradle of landscape and legend, that Ludwig spent his earliest years, years that would never truly leave him. He wandered the castle's gardens, lined with moss-covered stone and half-forgotten statues, and watched the seasons turn with reverence. In winter, the snow came softly, laying a white hush over every roof and branch. In summer, dragonflies danced over the lakes, and deer moved like shadows through the trees. Nature was not just scenery to Ludwig. It was a cathedral, a teacher, a presence. The whisper of wind through tall evergreens was to him like a hymn. The play of light on the surface of the water, like the brush of a story waiting to be told. He did not walk through the woods as a visitor, but as someone returning home. Every path was familiar, and every tree seemed to lean closer when he passed, as if guarding his solitude. The castle itself was steeped in tales. Its murals did not merely decorate its walls, they glowed with the weight of old stories. Swan-drawn chariots soared across painted skies. Golden-armored knights fought dragons and temptation. Forests glittered with enchantment. The stories came from many places: German folklore, medieval epics, Nordic sagas, sacred legend. But they converged here, in this house above the lakes, like threads drawn to a single loom. To most, they were images. To Ludwig, they were doorways. He would drift through the corridors alone, pausing before a single mural as if caught in conversation. Sometimes, a face in a painting would hold him for an hour. A queen with sorrowful eyes, a prince lifting a sword not in violence, but in devotion. The boy's mind would stir, scenes forming around the still image like fog curling from water. He did not just admire the stories, he stepped into them. In his imagination, he rode beside the knights, whispered prayers in moonlit chapels, held the reins of swans pulling silver boats through morning mist. While other children played games of war or practiced dances for courtly appearances, Ludwig wandered in silence, trailing his hand along cold stone walls, listening to echoes. He did not need company to feel accompanied. His mind was always full of stories, of songs, of visions no one else could see. His parents, King Maximilian II and Queen Marie of Prussia, were distant figures, more symbolic than familiar. Maximilian was a scholar, a collector of knowledge, often away or occupied with affairs of state. Marie was more present, but not always reachable. She had a softness about her, a kind of gentle melancholy that Ludwig admired, but she lived within the strict rhythms of court life and expectation. Their love was not unkind, but it lived at a distance, warm but filtered through duty. Much of Ludwig's upbringing fell to tutors and governesses, adults who taught him Latin, philosophy, geography, and the obligations of rule. But none could teach him how to belong. They praised his intelligence, worried over his aloofness, and failed to understand the deep ocean of longing that lived just beneath his silence. Books became his refuge. In their pages he found what real life withheld: passion, beauty, truth without compromise. He read the grim and glowing tales of the Brothers Grimm, where good and evil were painted in stark colors, and forests held both danger and redemption. He devoured German romantic poetry, Schiller, Heine, Novalis, and lingered over lines that spoke of transcendence, mystery, and loss. He read by firelight in winter, by moonlight in summer, letting the words fall around him like rain on leaves. And music. Music entered his soul like breath. The first time he heard a choral piece echo through the high ceilings of a nearby chapel, he felt as though he had been lifted from the ground. The voices wove together, not like melody and harmony, but like light and shadow. He felt music, not with his ears, but with his whole body. A single violin, played in a minor key, could move him to tears. A distant hymn, carried on the wind from a mountain village, could stop him in his tracks. Music did not entertain him. It revealed something. There was always something in Ludwig that did not match the world around him. He was drawn to the soft gold of evening, not the harsh glare of midday. He preferred candlelight to chandeliers, shadows to spotlights. He did not rush to command, but lingered in wonder. He was shy, but not afraid. He was gentle, but not weak. He once wrote, as a teenager, that he wished he could live 100 miles above the clouds, in a place untouched by noise, by cruelty, by expectation. He was not running from the world. He was searching for one that could hold him. He rarely played with other children, and when he did, it was with a kind of absent grace, as though part of him had remained behind, still walking the painted halls or listening for footsteps in the woods. His real companions were imaginary, figures drawn from myth, from paintings, from books. He spoke to them in whispered tones. They answered in silence. Of all these inner figures, one stood above the rest. Lohengrin, the Swan Knight, a solitary protector, pure of heart, who arrives without warning in a boat drawn by a swan, who serves with devotion, who vanishes when questioned. Lohengrin was not just a story Ludwig loved. He was a presence Ludwig believed in. He imagined him at night, standing by the lake. He wrote his name in the margins of notebooks. He whispered his story to the wind as he walked beneath the trees. In Lohengrin, Ludwig saw not a hero, but a mirror. And when the stories grew too loud to ignore, when the ache of wonder needed motion, Ludwig would slip from the castle, out into the forest, his footsteps muffled by moss and needles. He walked for hours, saying nothing, carrying no destination. Sometimes he brought a book, but more often nothing at all. The forest was enough. The branches overhead filtered the sunlight like stained glass. The streams whispered secrets. The wind hummed with its own language. Every leaf that fell, every stone on the path, every shift in shadow felt significant. Not grand, but sacred. And Ludwig, moving through it all, felt less like a boy and more like something older, something eternal walking in human shape. His younger brother Otto was livelier, more social, more adaptable to courtly expectations. But it was Ludwig who stood next in line for the throne. He knew what that meant. He did not dread it, but he did not long for it either. He understood early that kingship was not only ceremony and power, but performance. A life lived in mirrors and masks. And in his soul, he longed for something else. He did not want to rule men. He wanted to protect beauty. He did not crave authority. He craved the right to wonder. He did not dream of conquest. He dreamed of keeping something sacred from being forgotten. By 17, Ludwig had grown tall, with a regal presence that surprised those who had only heard of his quiet ways. His profile was sharp, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed both observant and distant. People paused when he entered a room, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried stillness like a kind of gravity. But behind that bearing lived the same boy, the one who listened to violins in the wind, who read legends by moonlight, who walked in silence beside invisible companions. He did not know how close the crown had come. There was no warning, no time to prepare. One day he was Ludwig, the Prince of Hohenschwangau, a dreamer among swans and stars. And the next He was King of Bavaria. The world had changed, but Ludwig's heart had not. And though the crown rested on his head, part of him would always remain behind, among painted legends beneath cathedral pines, following some distant music only he could hear. In March of 1864, a quiet shadow fell across the palaces of Munich. The air in the capital grew still, as if something unspoken had passed through the corridors before any word had been spoken aloud. King Maximilian II, once a steady if distant figure in Ludwig's life, had taken suddenly, grievously ill. The news came without warning, soft-footed and serious, whispered behind closed doors, passed in hushed voices through marble halls, hung with family portraits and centuries of expectation. There was no ceremony to mark the shift, no time for farewells or reflection. The illness moved swiftly, silently, like a tide rising in darkness, and within days the king was gone. Ludwig was just 18, still too young to have lived much, but no longer sheltered from what life could take away. He had only just begun the delicate transition between boyhood and manhood, still lingering in candlelit libraries, still scribbling imaginary battlements into the margins of his history books, still walking the edge of a world he had not yet entered 1 week. He was a prince, with ink-stained fingers and a gaze turned always skyward. The next, he stood on the cold threshold of power, tall and solemn in black, as the crown passed to him not in fire or flourish, but in the stillness of morning. There was no parade, no triumphant call of trumpets. The moment did not arrive with spectacle, but with silence. The kind of silence that falls after something has ended, but before anything new has begun. He stood in the throne room that first morning as king, the light falling in long gold beams through tall windows, and felt the weight of centuries settle invisibly upon his shoulders. Servants bowed. Ministers waited. The court held its breath. Bavaria, with all its ancient bloodlines, its proud noble houses, its mountain traditions and modern tensions, now belonged to a dreamer with a poet's soul. From the very beginning, Ludwig stood apart. He did not rush toward power, nor recoil from it. He approached it instead, with a kind of quiet formality, as though stepping onto a stage where he knew the script by heart, but could not quite speak the lines. Where others might have sought to impress, to lead boldly, to project confidence, Ludwig moved like someone walking through a dream, composed, refined, even regal, but oddly untouched. He accepted the ceremonies, fulfilled the rituals, but seemed to be observing it all from some place far away. The ministers around him took notice quickly. Some were patient, assuming youth was to blame, that time and responsibility would anchor him. Others muttered behind closed doors, disturbed by his solitude, his stillness, his preference for stargazing over statecraft. They expected fire or ambition, something they could recognize. Instead, they found a king who listened quietly, spoke only when pressed, and offered few opinions on matters of finance, defense, or diplomacy. Ludwig, for his part, never pretended to be something he wasn't. He fulfilled the ceremonial duties with dignity, read state documents with a detached thoroughness, and sat through council meetings with a posture of attention. But not the spirit, his mind was elsewhere. Not out of disrespect, but because it simply lived in a different landscape. He had no taste for debates, no appetite for strategy. Public life exhausted him, the way voices overlapped, the way power was wielded not for beauty, but for gain. He recoiled from court intrigue and could hardly endure the shallow theatre of politics. He had grown up seeking meaning in silence and music, not argument. He had spent his youth listening for what was eternal. And now, surrounded by the noise of government, he found himself more alone than ever. And yet, what stirred in Ludwig was not apathy. It was longing, not for influence or recognition, but for something beautiful, lasting, sacred. He preferred letters to speeches, poems to proclamations, the cathedral hush of dreams to the clatter of governance. At night, when the obligations of rule had quieted and the palace had dimmed, Ludwig would retreat to his private chambers. There, by the glow of oil lamps and candlelight, he surrounded himself with the things that made his spirit breathe. Old volumes of poetry, illustrations of Gothic cathedrals, books on medieval heraldry, treatises on myth and symbology, music manuscripts. Sometimes he would write long letters to no one in particular, letters filled with aching prose about beauty, about memory, about the world he wished he could build. The castle was his, but it did not feel like home. The throne was his, but it did not feel like destiny. What he wanted, what he truly wanted, could not be found in Munich, nor granted by ministers. It lived elsewhere, in dreams, in legends, in sound. So instead of surrounding himself with soldiers and diplomats, Ludwig began to draw a different kind of circle around him, one made not of power, but of imagination. He sought the company of artists, poets, architects, designers. People who thought in color and form and music. People who believed, as he did, that the soul had a language beyond words, that beauty could be sacred, that art could be a kind of worship. And at the center of this inner court, the one Ludwig chose rather than inherited, stood a man whose work had captivated him since youth, a man whose operas he'd first read in secret, long before he ever heard them played. A man who had given voice, in thunder and velvet, to the longing Ludwig had never known how to name. Richard Wagner. To Ludwig, Wagner was not just a composer. He was an oracle. The music stirred something ancient and luminous within him, something he felt in the blood, in the breath, in the bones of the world. It wasn't just melody or drama. It was architecture in sound. In the storm-wrapped overtures of Tannhäuser, in the shimmering purity of Lohengrin, in the doomed ecstasy of Tristan und Isolde, Ludwig felt seen, understood, reflected. These were not operas to him. They were sacred texts. Wagner's heroes were not heroes of logic, but of heart. They battled not for power, but for love, for truth, for something just out of reach. They longed for redemption, for beauty, for union with the divine. They stood between this world and another, uncertain of which they belonged to. So when Ludwig became king, it did not take long for him to act. With great excitement and with the generosity of someone who had waited years for this moment, he invited Wagner to Bavaria. The composer, already exiled, scandalized, admired, and feared in equal measure, arrived in Munich like a whirlwind. Ludwig greeted him with reverence, almost awe. It was not the greeting of king to subject, but of soul to soul. He offered Wagner not only funding, but friendship, not just support, but sanctuary. The king gave him a home near Lake Starnberg, cleared his debts, arranged performances, commissioned new works. The two men met often, sometimes late into the night, speaking in bursts of poetic intensity about music, myth, and the role of art in shaping the soul. Their letters were long, emotional, filled with grand phrases and ecstatic declarations. They spoke to one another as if cast from the same dream. But in the court, that dream rang with alarm bells. Wagner was brilliant, yes, but also flamboyant, divisive, and dangerously independent. His influence over Ludwig raised eyebrows. Ministers whispered of manipulation, of overreach, of a composer who played politics as boldly as he played the orchestra. They warned the king, gently at first, then more directly. But Ludwig would not be swayed. He saw in Wagner not a risk, but a reflection, a fellow exile in spirit. Yet even as his devotion to Wagner deepened, Ludwig's connection to the world outside continued to unravel. He grew quieter, harder to reach. He stopped attending most court functions. He let his ministers take over more and more of the day-to-day rule, while he drifted deeper into a world of imagination. When asked for decisions, he gave them, sometimes late, sometimes vague, but he rarely explained. He disappeared for long stretches to mountain residences, where he read, wrote, and dreamed in solitude. In his letters from this time, his tone flickers between weariness and wonder. He speaks of duty like a distant storm. He speaks of longing like a religion. He writes of the earthly world as if it were a heavy coat he could not take off. "Only in dreams," he wrote once, "does my soul find breath." And when even the dreams inside Munich grew too faint, he returned to the mountains. He returned to Neuschwanstein, not the place, but the feeling. The green hush, the water like glass, the sky that hung like a question. He stood once again at the edge of the glacial lakes he had watched as a boy and felt something ancient rise within him, something that could not be ruled, only made. He would not build a palace. He would build a vision, not a residence, but a refuge, not a symbol of power, but a cathedral to wonder. And so the sketches began, the plans, the letters to architects. He drew towers that reached into the sky like prayers, windows shaped like storybook size, balconies from which a swan might call out to a distant king. Every element drawn not from rule, but from reverence. This place would not be for ministers. It would be for music, for solitude, for silence, for the sacred and impossible. The first stones were laid just above the meadows of his childhood. And what would rise there, slowly, over the coming years, would be far more than a castle. It would be a mirror, not of a kingdom, but of the king himself. High above the green hills and glimmering lakes of southern Bavaria, a vision was unfolding, slowly, stubbornly, like something trying to cross the fragile boundary between dream and earth. At first, it existed only in silence. It appeared in the margins of letters, in the flicker of candlelight on vellum paper, in the quiet mind of a king who no longer found his reflection in the world around him. It was not formed in brick or timber, but in fragments of poetry, in the soaring music of Wagner, and in childhood memories shaped by mountain mist. By the early 1870s, Ludwig had already begun to drift away from the mechanics of monarchy and into the realm of myth and imagination. His relationship with public life had grown thin, worn by the weight of duty and the noise of a world he could neither change nor fully understand. In the solitude of Bavaria's southern highlands, above the forested valley of Hohenschwangau, where he had once wandered as a boy, Ludwig found what he believed was a sight worthy of his most sacred vision. He would build a castle, not for power, not for courtly life, but for memory, for music, for the soul, and he would name it Neuschwanstein, the new swan stone. The name itself held layers of meaning. It echoed the legends of Lohengrin, the swan knight of medieval myth, whose tale had wrapped itself around Ludwig's heart since boyhood. It paid homage to the nearby Schwangau, the Swan district, with its long-standing regional heraldry and folkloric associations. But more than that, the name suggested a new beginning, a resurrection of beauty and chivalry in a world that had long forgotten both. Neuschwanstein would not be a residence in the conventional sense. It would be a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art fusing architecture, painting, sculpture, music, and myth into a unified, immersive whole. It would be Ludwig's spiritual refuge and his aesthetic manifesto, a place where he could live, not as a ruler of a modern kingdom, but as the guardian of an ideal. Ludwig chose the site with deep deliberation. The rocky hill known as the Jugend rose nearly 200 meters above the valley floor, perched between the Alpsar and Schwansee lakes and overlooking his beloved Hohenschwangau castle. From this vantage point, the views swept across forested ridges, shimmering water, and distant snow-capped peaks, a setting at once remote, romantic, and almost impossibly dramatic. But it was also wildly impractical. There was no road, no foundation. The terrain was steep, jagged, and riddled with outcrops. Winter arrived early and stayed late. Winds howled through the Pellet Gorge, and the stream below surged with snowmelt. Yet none of these challenges dissuaded Ludwig. If anything, they confirmed the sanctity of the place. It was unreachable by accident. One had to seek it out. In 1868, preparatory work began. A road was cut into the hillside, zigzagging up from the village below. This road alone took 2 years to complete. Tons of materials had to be hauled uphill. Sandstone from Nuremberg, bricks from Augsburg, marble from Untersberg, and lime from quarries miles away. Timber was harvested locally, but processed far from the site. All of it had to be transported by oxen, mules, or horse-drawn sledges, depending on the season. Work was slow. Nature was unforgiving. And yet the vision remained constant. In 1869, the cornerstone was laid, a quiet event, far from the ceremonial spectacle one might expect from a royal project. Ludwig was not interested in spectacle. He was building something sacred. The original architectural plans were drafted by Christian Jank, a theatrical set designer rather than a trained architect. Jank's drawings were fantastical. High towers, impossible heights, dramatic silhouettes that looked more like opera backdrops than blueprints. But this was exactly what Ludwig wanted. He was not building for utility, he was building for effect. To bring Yank's vision to life, Ludwig enlisted Eduard Riedel, a seasoned architect and engineer who had worked on court projects before. Riedel translated the stage-like visions into workable plans, or tried to. In time, he would be replaced by Georg von Dollmann and later by Julius Hoffmann, each man bringing new adaptations and solving ever more complex logistical problems as the design evolved. For Neuschwanstein was always changing. The final result bore little resemblance to the earliest drawings. Towers were added, moved, removed. The scale increased. Rooms were reimagined entirely mid-construction. Ludwig often made decisions himself, sometimes on a whim, sometimes after long nights spent sketching by candlelight. He would send instructions directly to the site, detailed, poetic, sometimes contradictory. The architects were exasperated. The king was undeterred. By the early 1870s, construction was fully underway. At its peak, more than 300 workers labored on the site, often from dawn until dusk. Many slept in temporary barracks built on the mountainside. Accidents were common. Injuries and illnesses swept through the camp. During harsh winters, work paused entirely as snow made the site inaccessible. Foundational work occupied the first decade. The base of the structure had to be reinforced with an enormous concrete platform, an unusually modern material at the time, chosen for its strength beneath the foundations. Vast retaining walls were poured to stabilize the hill. The castle itself began to rise slowly, its limestone facade gleaming like snow against the dark green of the forest. By 1880, much of the outer shell was complete. The gatehouse, built in Romanesque revival style with red brick and crenellations, was the first fully finished portion. It served as temporary quarters for Ludwig during his early visits. The massive palace, the main residential building, followed, its towers rising in stages. The tallest tower, the keep, reached nearly 65 meters in height. Every element was handcrafted. Artisans from across the kingdom were brought in. Woodcarvers, fresco painters, stonemasons, ironworkers. Ceiling vaults were painted to resemble stars. Columns were shaped like tree trunks. Walls became murals. Railings were engraved. Even door handles and hinges were bespoke, many bearing swan motifs or heraldic emblems. The interior decoration was guided by Ludwig himself, with the help of theatrical painters such as Ferdinand Piloty and Joseph Eigner, who treated the castle less like a home and more like a stage. Each room told a story, usually drawn from Germanic legends, medieval epics, or the operas of Wagner. Among the most stunning spaces was the throne room, built in Byzantine style with marble steps, gilded columns, and a glittering mosaic floor featuring animal and plant symbolism. A vast, double-height space with a vaulted ceiling, it was meant to evoke both imperial majesty and divine order. Yet it was never completed. No throne was ever placed within its apse. The Hall of the Singers, modelled after the Great Hall of Wartburg Castle, was the largest room in the castle and one of Ludwig's favourites. It was intended not for balls or state banquets, but for quiet contemplation and staged performances of Wagner's operas, though few were ever held. Ludwig's bedroom, completed in 1884 after more than 4 years of work, was one of the most intricate spaces in the entire castle. Its neo-Gothic woodwork was hand-carved with astonishing detail. Vines, saints, arches, angels. The room contained a secret passage to the adjacent oratory and a private balcony overlooking the Alps. It was here that Ludwig would stand, often in silence, looking out over the mountains he had loved since childhood. And then, between two rooms, like a secret kept between breaths, lay the grotto. A man-made cave, cooled with a waterfall and lit by coloured lights, the grotto was Ludwig's most surreal creation. It defied architectural convention. It belonged to no style. It had no function. And yet, it was perhaps the truest expression of who he was. A place where water, light and sound merged in mystery. Sometimes he would sit there in silence. Sometimes he would float alone in a golden swan boat, while Wagner's music was played from hidden sources, echoing off damp stone like voices from another world. Though Ludwig dreamed of completion, Neuschwanstein was never finished. By the time of his death in 1886, only about 14 of the more than 200 planned rooms had been fully completed. Much of the interior remained skeletal, unfinished, abandoned. Construction continued in fits and starts, then was eventually halted. Despite its incompleteness, Ludwig moved in, quietly, privately, in 1884. He lived alone, visited only by a few trusted servants. There were no banquets, no visitors. The castle remained closed to the world. It was not a place for kingship. It was a place for retreat, for reverence, for remembering. Ludwig would walk its halls by candlelight, stopping before murals to study the eyes of a painted knight or the curve of a swan's wing. He would sit in silence for hours, listening to the hush between the notes. He had built not a court, but a cathedral to longing. And in that cathedral he began to fade. Even now, Neuschwanstein stands, not just as a monument to Ludwig's dreams, but as a paradox. It is both storybook and stronghold, both retreat and revelation. A place where architecture becomes emotion and stone becomes prayer. A castle that was never finished. A dream that was never meant to be. And yet it endures. High in the Bavarian sky, a pale echo of a soul who asked not to be remembered by power, but by beauty. Beyond the peaks and forests, past the winding trails and glacial lakes that glimmered like secrets under the Bavarian sun, there stretched a quiet valley carved by ice, time, and silence. It was a place not marked on any itinerary of power. Here, where the Ammergau Alps softened into rolling hills and moss-covered boulders slumbered beneath ancient trees, Ludwig found a second refuge, one smaller than Neuschwanstein, but perhaps closer to the core of his longing. He called it Linderhof. Of all Ludwig's creations, Linderhof was the only palace he saw fully completed in his lifetime. Yet it did not rise with the grandeur of Neuschwanstein's towers, nor stand aloof like Herrenchiemsee on its watery island. It nestled instead into the landscape, as though it had grown there like a white blossom from the forest floor. It was compact, symmetrical, precise. And while Neuschwanstein was built to echo myth, and Herrenchiemsee to mirror glory, Linderhof was built for retreat. A palace not of rulership, but of retreat and reverie. The roots of Linderhof reached back to Ludwig's childhood. On the site once stood a small hunting lodge belonging to his father, Maximilian II. As a boy, Ludwig had visited it often, enchanted by the surrounding meadows, the dense woods that seemed to hum with mystery, and the quiet that fell like snow over the valley. Later, when his responsibilities as king grew heavier, he returned not as a boy on holiday, but as a man in search of sanctuary. The original lodge was dismantled in the late 1860s, and Ludwig began work on a much grander vision, a French-style palace nestled deep in the Bavarian wilderness. Unlike the vertical drama of Neuschwanstein, Linderhof would be intimate, reflective, and entirely personal. He based its design loosely on Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's private retreat at Versailles, but gilded it with his own ideas, fantasies, and symbols. Construction began in 1874 and continued until 1886. Ludwig was deeply involved in every detail, from the architecture down to the embroidery patterns on cushions. The palace was built in the Second Rococo style, a movement Ludwig admired for its ornate playfulness and romantic elegance. The result was a jewel box of a building, small in scale, but breathtaking in execution. White stucco walls gleamed in the mountain light, trimmed with columns and sculptural ornament. The entrance facade featured a double stair and statues of regal mythological figures. Surrounding the palace were elaborate French formal gardens, complete with cascading fountains, sculpted terraces, and tree-lined paths that curved gracefully toward hidden groves. Each aspect of the landscape was carefully arranged to reflect Ludwig's inner life. There were no random paths, no wild overgrowth. Everything was deliberate, a symphony of nature shaped into harmony. Ludwig believed that beauty was not found, but made, and that in making it, he was protecting a fragile truth from the coarse noise of the modern world. Stepping inside Linderhof was like entering the dream of someone who had spent a lifetime staring into mirrors and candle flames. Every surface shimmered. The ceilings soared with frescoes of Apollo and Aurora, gods of dawn and light. Chandeliers made of crystal and gold hung like frozen stars, and gilded mouldings curled across the walls like vines in bloom. There were 10 rooms in total, not many, but each an immersive world unto itself. The audience chamber, rich with blue damask and golden eagles, was designed as if Ludwig might receive guests of state. But in truth, he never did. The throne in this room was never occupied. It remained ceremonial, like a stage left prepared for a play that would never begin. In the dining room, Ludwig had installed one of the palace's most peculiar features, the Tischlein deck dich, or little dining table that sets itself. This ingenious mechanism allowed the dining table to be lowered through the floor to the kitchen below, where servants would set the courses, then raise it again to the dining level, allowing Ludwig to eat without ever being seen or interrupted. The king dined in absolute solitude, surrounded by gilded mirrors and candlelight, often in full costume, as though playing a role only he could name. And then there was the Hall of Mirrors, perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful room in the entire palace. Here, hundreds of candles would be lit at once, their flames multiplied infinitely across mirrored walls. Ludwig often spent hours here, pacing slowly, lost in the shifting reflections, his figure folding and unfolding into a dozen angles of light and shadow. It was not vanity that kept him there, but fascination. In these endless echoes, he could escape the prison of a single identity. He could be anyone or no one. His daily rhythms reversed. While his ministers in Munich conducted business beneath noon suns, Ludwig rose with the moon. He wandered Linderhof's corridors by starlight, dressed in flowing robes of silk and velvet. He read French poetry, recited lines from Wagner's librettos, and stood by high windows, watching the fog rise through pine branches like breath. Music was always present, usually Wagner, played from hidden chambers or small orchestras placed out of sight. The prelude to Parsifal, the yearning notes of Tristan and Isolde, the mournful refrain of Lohengrin, all became the language of the house. But Ludwig's strangest, most surreal creation at Linderhof was Venus Grotto. Completed in 1877 and inspired by the Venusberg scene in Wagner's Tannhäuser, the grotto was a completely artificial cave built into a hillside near the palace. The cave had no precedent in royal architecture. It was a fantasy, part opera set, part underwater cathedral. Inside, painters and engineers created stalactites, hidden lighting effects, and a subterranean lake lit by electricity, one of the earliest private uses of the technology in Europe. A golden swan boat, modelled after Lohengrin's mythic vessel, floated on the water, tethered to nothing but silence. Ludwig would sit in it alone, cradled by the gentle lapping of the water and the haunting echoes of Wagner's music, often played live by musicians hidden in an alcove. Lights would shift through blues, purples, and golds, casting strange shadows on the faux rock walls. He would drift like a figure caught between worlds, part king, part myth, part memory. The grotto was not a curiosity to him. It was sacred, a place where the barriers of reality thinned, where he could leave the self behind and become something larger, a soul at rest in the silence of imagination. As the years passed, Ludwig became ever more elusive. He no longer answered many letters. He saw few people, save a handful of trusted servants and attendants. He would vanish into the forest for long walks. Some claimed they saw him talking to the trees. Others said he had begun to believe he was no longer a man at all, but a character in an old tale. Yet in this fading from public life, something luminous was still being shaped, a kind of spiritual architecture, built not in stone, but in gesture, silence, and longing. Linderhof became a mirror of that inner architecture. It was not a palace of power, but of prayer, a living poem written in architecture, a confession rendered in chandeliers and velvet. But even Linderhof could not contain his yearning forever. Herren Chiemsee, the last dream. Eventually, Ludwig's imagination turned toward one final creation, something larger than retreat, more perfect than peace. It was to be his last act of devotion to art and beauty, a new Versailles, built not for history, but for its ghost. He called it Herren Chiemsee. Located on Herreninsel, the largest island on the Chiemsee Lake, the site was secluded and serene, accessible only by boat. It was here, in 1878, that Ludwig began building his most ambitious and extravagant palace, designed to honor Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. Ludwig revered Louis not for his autocracy, but for his theatrical reverence for beauty, light, and court ritual as a sacred art form. Herrenchiemsee would not be a palace for courtiers or gatherings, but a shrine to that vanished world. Construction was grueling. Materials had to be ferried to the island. Laborers lived in temporary shelters. Costs soared. Yet Ludwig spared no expense. Over 20 million gold marks were poured into Herrenchiemsee, much of it borrowed. And yet only a portion of the palace was ever completed. Of the planned 70 rooms, only 20 were finished by the time of his death. But those 20 were extraordinary. The Hall of Mirrors, even more opulent than Versailles, stretched nearly 100 meters and gleamed with gold, glass, and light. But no guests ever danced beneath its chandeliers. No ministers debated policy in its salons. Ludwig walked its length alone, sometimes in silence, sometimes accompanied by a single echoing piece of music. His bedchamber was enormous, twice the size of any other royal bedchamber in Europe, and filled with celestial iconography. His dressing room was designed so that servants would never see him enter or leave mechanical devices, delivered clothing and meals unseen. Privacy had become an obsession, or perhaps a sacrament. But as the palace grew, Ludwig shrank from the world. His correspondence became cryptic, his debts deepened, his absences widened. In Munich, ministers spoke in whispers, and in the mirrored halls of Herrenchiemsee, a solitary figure walked through silence, not in grandeur, but in farewell. Ludwig was no longer building palaces. He was building a dream into which he could disappear. But even in solitude, the silence was never truly empty. It was filled with sound, not of voices or footsteps, but of music, soft, unseen, unending. In the candlelit halls of Neuschwanstein, in the mirrored quiet of Linderhof, in the gold-drenched hush of Herrenchiemsee, there was always music. It drifted from hidden chambers. It echoed faintly along corridors lined with painted knights and holy fools. It played in the early hours before dawn, when Ludwig was most awake, most alive. It filled his carriages as he travelled through pine-dark forests. It floated beside him on lakes beneath a cold and endless moon. Music, to Ludwig, was not entertainment. It was breath. It was light. It was the only language that ever felt complete. In music, he found a refuge deeper than stone, a kingdom untouched by law or time, a place where sorrow was not a weight, but a path, where longing was not weakness, but purpose, where beauty at last could speak. And from the moment he first heard it, there was one voice that carried him more than any other, one soul whose music did not merely echo his own, but revealed it. Richard Wagner. Ludwig discovered Wagner before he understood power, before he had been shaped by the loneliness of the throne. As a boy wandering the halls of Hohenschwangau, he found Wagner's librettos tucked into his father's library. The poems struck him long before the melodies did. He read them slowly, like sacred texts. He imagined the silver woods, the hooded saints, the luminous lakes where nights appeared out of fog. These stories felt like memories rather than inventions. Each one awakened something in him that he had never known how to name. And then came the music. The first time he heard Wagner's operas performed, the sound did not simply fill the concert hall. It felt as though the walls had opened and the sky had poured in. The music rose around him like vast weather. It trembled with prophecy. It carried both grief and radiance. It was too large for the room and too large for speech. Ludwig sat in silence afterward, unable to speak, unable even to stand for several minutes. He left that performance changed. It felt as if the music had touched a door inside him that had always been locked. What held him most were the stories. Wagner's worlds were not shaped by politics or practicality. They were shaped by destiny, sacrifice, and longing. They were woven from the threads of mythic grief and mythic courage. They felt like reminders of a time when kings were symbols rather than bureaucrats, when sorrow was not hidden, and when beauty had the power to save. Ludwig saw himself in these tales so clearly that the boundary between opera and identity began to blur. Lohengrin became more than a character. He became a guiding star. Ludwig imagined him standing at the edge of a lake lit by moonlight, his silver armor glowing softly through the mist. In Lohengrin's silence, Ludwig saw his own. In Lohengrin's departure, he felt his own loneliness. He whispered Lohengrin's vows in long corridors, praying for the courage to live a life of purity and devotion. Parsifal touched a deeper place. The holy fool who wanders in confusion, who learns through loss, who heals through suffering. Ludwig saw in him the dignity of innocence misunderstood. He saw the ache of a kingdom that could not recognize a gentle heart as strength. And Tristan, with his love that blurred the boundary between life and death, awakened Ludwig's hidden longing. Tristan's devotion was not sentimental, it was absolute. It carried him past the limits of the world. Ludwig understood that kind of yearning, the kind that becomes an atmosphere rather than an emotion. These characters did not remain in stories. They walked with him, quietly, through forests and corridors. Their names formed a kind of prayer on his lips. Their voices became his companions when flesh and blood companions failed him. So when Ludwig became king, it was almost inevitable that he would bring Wagner to Bavaria. Their first meeting felt charged with fate. Wagner arrived with the force of a storm, full of intensity and brilliance and relentless ideas. Ludwig greeted him with the reverence one gives to a long-awaited teacher. The contrast between them was vivid. Wagner overflowed with drama, Ludwig carried quiet longing. Yet something in that contrast drew them together. They recognized in each other a devotion to beauty that transcended practical life. Ludwig offered Wagner more than financial support. He offered sanctuary. He offered belief. He offered a place where Wagner could create without apology. He settled Wagner's debts, provided him a residence near Lake Starnberg, gave him freedom from criticism, and encouraged him to think on a grander scale. The theatre at Bayreuth became their shared dream. Ludwig imagined it as a temple of myth, a place where audiences would surrender themselves completely to the power of story and sound. Their letters were filled with the language of devotion. They wrote of destiny, of inner fire, of visions that felt too large to belong to the modern world. Wagner praised Ludwig's purity of heart. Ludwig praised Wagner's fire of spirit. They spoke of their friendship with an intensity that both enchanted and alarmed those around them. But the court did not understand. Wagner's presence unsettled the ministers. They distrusted his confidence and his disregard for politics. They feared the strength of his influence. They whispered that he was using the king. They worried Ludwig was drifting into an artistic dream from which he might never return. They also feared what they could not name: the strange intimacy between Ludwig and Wagner, the devotion that seemed to transcend reason. It was not just Wagner's music that unsettled them. It was the king's open reverence, his vulnerability, his abandonment of caution. To them, Ludwig's obsession with Wagner was dangerous because it was sincere. In time, pressure grew too great. Wagner was forced to leave Bavaria. It was not the dramatic exile of legend, but a quiet, painful distancing that cut deeply on both sides. Still, their bond survived distance. Ludwig continued to support Wagner from afar. He funded the building of the Bayreuth Theatre with secret resources. He followed Wagner's operas from draft to completion, reading scenes as they were written. He sent letters filled with poetic admiration and silent longing. Even after they saw each other rarely, Wagner remained the central spiritual presence in Ludwig's life. The Bayreuth Festival became a kind of pilgrimage site in Ludwig's imagination. He rarely attended in person, always reluctant to be seen. But he read the reviews, memorized the set lists, and sent lavish gifts to Wagner in thanks. Sometimes he would stage private recreations of Bayreuth performances in his own palace chambers, using actors, singers, and musicians who performed not for an audience, but for the king alone. Wagner's music became woven into the fabric of Ludwig's days and nights. In Neuschwanstein, Ludwig commissioned entire rooms to honor Wagner's operas. Murals portrayed Lohengrin's arrival, Tristan's grief, Siegfried's courage. The staircases curled like musical phrases. The ceilings rose like overtures. He built Neuschwanstein as a tribute to the worlds Wagner had opened in his heart. At Linderhof, the influence deepened. Scenes from Wagner's operas filled the walls. Ludwig's artificial grotto, complete with hidden lights, flowing water, and his golden swan boat, was designed for one purpose: to experience Wagner's music in the solitude of a dream. Ludwig drifted across the grotto lake as the opening to Lohengrin played. The water reflected the colors of enchanted light. The music echoed in the stone. It felt like stepping into the legend itself. At Herrenchiemsee, though the palace was built in homage to Versailles, Wagner remained present in the silence. Ludwig walked those gilded corridors alone, hearing Wagner's notes in memory, feeling the weight of those operas as if they were the heartbeat of the walls. Sometimes he would spend hours simply listening. He would instruct musicians to perform select scenes in hidden chambers while he remained unseen. The singers would perform in half light, unsure whether the king was present or not. Only the soft sound of a chair creaking or the faint brush of velvet robes revealed that he was there, listening with such intensity that it felt like prayer. When Wagner died in 1883, Ludwig felt something collapse inside him. The world seemed colder, flatter, more ordinary. Something immense had gone out of the sky. For days, the king shut himself away, saying almost nothing, listening to the music that had once promised he would never truly be alone. He wandered his castles in silence. He lit no chandeliers. He ate little. He stood for hours before paintings of Parsifal and Lohengrin, his hands clasped behind his back, as if waiting for the images to move. He ordered new recordings of the operas. He refused to speak when they played. He drifted from room to room in his long robes, not speaking, not asking, listening. Yet even in loss, Wagner's world did not leave him. Ludwig continued to live inside the operas. They became his quiet scripture, his solace, his compass in moments when he no longer trusted the world around him. He played the music late into the night. He walked the halls of Neuschwanstein while the prelude to Tristan und Isolde trembled softly through the air. He read passages from the librettos as one might read prayers. He whispered them when the torches burned low. Wagner had given Ludwig a universe where longing was not illness, but strength. A world where sorrow had meaning. A world where a gentle heart could still be noble. In those operas, Ludwig did not feel out of place. There, he was not a king misunderstood by his ministers. He was not a ruler who longed for silence more than ceremony. In those stories, he belonged. He belonged among knights who vanished into mist. He belonged among holy wanderers searching for grace. He belonged among lovers who crossed into eternity. He belonged in the place where longing itself was honored. Wagner had not simply shaped Ludwig's imagination, he had named his soul. But even in solitude, the silence was never truly empty. It was filled with sound, not of voices or footsteps, but of music, soft, unseen, unending. In the candlelit halls of Neuschwanstein, in the mirrored quiet of Linderhof, in the gold-drenched hush of Herrenchiemsee, there was always music. It drifted from hidden chambers. It echoed faintly along corridors lined with painted knights and holy fools. It played in the early hours before dawn, when Ludwig was most awake, most alive. It filled his carriages as he travelled through pine-dark forests. It floated beside him on lakes beneath a cold and endless moon. Music, to Ludwig, was not entertainment. It was breath. It was light. It was the only language that ever felt complete. In music, he found a refuge deeper than stone, a kingdom untouched by law or time, a place where sorrow was not a weight, but a path, where longing was not weakness, but purpose, where beauty at last could speak. And from the moment he first heard it, there was one voice that carried him more than any other, one soul whose music did not merely echo his own, but revealed it. Richard Wagner. Ludwig discovered Wagner before he understood power, before he had been shaped by the loneliness of the throne. As a boy wandering the halls of Hohenschwangau, he found Wagner's librettos tucked into his father's library. The poems struck him long before the melodies did. He read them slowly, like sacred texts. He imagined the silver woods, the hooded saints, the luminous lakes where nights appeared out of fog. These stories felt like memories rather than inventions. Each one awakened something in him that he had never known how to name. And then came the music. The first time he heard Wagner's operas performed, The sound did not simply fill the concert hall. It felt as though the walls had opened and the sky had poured in. The music rose around him like vast weather. It trembled with prophecy. It carried both grief and radiance. It was too large for the room and too large for speech. Ludwig sat in silence afterward, unable to speak, unable even to stand for several minutes. He left that performance changed. It felt as if the music had touched a door inside him that had always been locked. What held him most were the stories. Wagner's worlds were not shaped by politics or practicality. They were shaped by destiny, sacrifice, and longing. They were woven from the threads of mythic grief and mythic courage. They felt like reminders of a time when kings were symbols rather than bureaucrats, when sorrow was not hidden, and when beauty had the power to save. Ludwig saw himself in these tales so clearly that the boundary between opera and identity began to blur. Lohengrin became more than a character. He became a guiding star. Ludwig imagined him standing at the edge of a lake lit by moonlight, his silver armor glowing softly through the mist. In Lohengrin's silence, Ludwig saw his own. In Lohengrin's departure, he felt his own loneliness. He whispered Lohengrin's vows in long corridors, praying for the courage to live a life of purity and devotion. Parsifal touched a deeper place. The holy fool who wanders in confusion, who learns through loss, who heals through suffering. Ludwig saw in him the dignity of innocence misunderstood. He saw the ache of a kingdom that could not recognize a gentle heart as strength. And Tristan, with his love that blurred the boundary between life and death, awakened Ludwig's hidden longing. Tristan's devotion was not sentimental, it was absolute. It carried him past the limits of the world. Ludwig understood that kind of yearning, the kind that becomes an atmosphere rather than an emotion. These characters did not remain in stories. They walked with him, quietly, through forests and corridors. Their names formed a kind of prayer on his lips. Their voices became his companions when flesh and blood companions failed him. So when Ludwig became king, it was almost inevitable that he would bring Wagner to Bavaria. Their first meeting felt charged with fate. Wagner arrived with the force of a storm, full of intensity and brilliance and relentless ideas. Ludwig greeted him with the reverence one gives to a long-awaited teacher. The contrast between them was vivid. Wagner overflowed with drama, Ludwig carried quiet longing. Yet something in that contrast drew them together. They recognized in each other a devotion to beauty that transcended practical life. Ludwig offered Wagner more than financial support. He offered sanctuary. He offered belief. He offered a place where Wagner could create without apology. He settled Wagner's debts, provided him a residence near Lake Starnberg, gave him freedom from criticism, and encouraged him to think on a grander scale. The theatre at Bayreuth became their shared dream. Ludwig imagined it as a temple of myth, a place where audiences would surrender themselves completely to the power of story and sound. Their letters were filled with the language of devotion. They wrote of destiny, of inner fire, of visions that felt too large to belong to the modern world. Wagner praised Ludwig's purity of heart. Ludwig praised Wagner's fire of spirit. They spoke of their friendship with an intensity that both enchanted and alarmed those around them. But the court did not understand. Wagner's presence unsettled the ministers. They distrusted his confidence and his disregard for politics. They feared the strength of his influence. They whispered that he was using the king. They worried Ludwig was drifting into an artistic dream from which he might never return. They also feared what they could not name: the strange intimacy between Ludwig and Wagner, the devotion that seemed to transcend reason. It was not just Wagner's music that unsettled them. It was the king's open reverence, his vulnerability, his abandonment of caution. To them, Ludwig's obsession with Wagner was dangerous because it was sincere. In time, pressure grew too great. Wagner was forced to leave Bavaria. It was not the dramatic exile of legend, but a quiet, painful distancing that cut deeply on both sides. Still, their bond survived distance. Ludwig continued to support Wagner from afar. He funded the building of the Bayreuth Theatre with secret resources. He followed Wagner's operas from draft to completion, reading scenes as they were written. He sent letters filled with poetic admiration and silent longing. Even after they saw each other rarely, Wagner remained the central spiritual presence in Ludwig's life. The Bayreuth Festival became a kind of pilgrimage site in Ludwig's imagination. He rarely attended in person, always reluctant to be seen. But he read the reviews, memorized the set lists, and sent lavish gifts to Wagner in thanks. Sometimes he would stage private recreations of Bayreuth performances in his own palace chambers, using actors, singers, and musicians who performed not for an audience, but for the king alone. Wagner's music became woven into the fabric of Ludwig's days and nights. In Neuschwanstein, Ludwig commissioned entire rooms to honor Wagner's operas. Murals portrayed Lohengrin's arrival, Tristan's grief, Siegfried's courage. The staircases curled like musical phrases. The ceilings rose like overtures. He built Neuschwanstein as a tribute to the worlds Wagner had opened in his heart. At Linderhof, the influence deepened. Scenes from Wagner's operas filled the walls. Ludwig's artificial grotto, complete with hidden lights, flowing water, and his golden swan boat, was designed for one purpose: to experience Wagner's music in the solitude of a dream. Ludwig drifted across the grotto lake as the opening to Lohengrin played. The water reflected the colors of enchanted light. The music echoed in the stone. It felt like stepping into the legend itself. At Herrenchiemsee, though the palace was built in homage to Versailles, Wagner remained present in the silence. Ludwig walked those gilded corridors alone, hearing Wagner's notes in memory, feeling the weight of those operas as if they were the heartbeat of the walls. Sometimes he would spend hours simply listening. He would instruct musicians to perform select scenes in hidden chambers while he remained unseen. The singers would perform in half light, unsure whether the king was present or not. Only the soft sound of a chair creaking or the faint brush of velvet robes revealed that he was there, listening with such intensity that it felt like prayer. When Wagner died in 1883, Ludwig felt something collapse inside him. The world seemed colder, flatter, more ordinary. Something immense had gone out of the sky. For days, the king shut himself away, saying almost nothing, listening to the music that had once promised he would never truly be alone. He wandered his castles in silence. He lit no chandeliers. He ate little. He stood for hours before paintings of Parsifal and Lohengrin, his hands clasped behind his back, as if waiting for the images to move. He ordered new recordings of the operas. He refused to speak when they played. He drifted from room to room in his long robes, not speaking, not asking, listening. Yet even in loss, Wagner's world did not leave him. Ludwig continued to live inside the operas. They became his quiet scripture, his solace, his compass in moments when he no longer trusted the world around him. He played the music late into the night. He walked the halls of Neuschwanstein while the prelude to Tristan und Isolde trembled softly through the air. He read passages from the librettos as one might read prayers. He whispered them when the torches burned low. Wagner had given Ludwig a universe where longing was not illness, but strength. A world where sorrow had meaning. A world where a gentle heart could still be noble. In those operas, Ludwig did not feel out of place. There, he was not a king misunderstood by his ministers. He was not a ruler who longed for silence more than ceremony. In those stories, he belonged. He belonged among knights who vanished into mist. He belonged among holy wanderers searching for grace. He belonged among lovers who crossed into eternity. He belonged in the place where longing itself was honored. Wagner had not simply shaped Ludwig's imagination, he had named his soul. Time moved quietly, but the world beyond Ludwig's mountains did not stand still. While he drifted through torchlit halls and wandered through moonlit gardens, the machinery of government, ever restless and rational, continued to turn outside the walls of Neuschwanstein. Budgets ballooned and patience thinned. Ministers tallied accounts. Auditors traced the lines between royal imagination and national expenditure. They watched the projects multiply. They watched their king retreat. He no longer appeared at court, no longer spoke in chambers. He no longer walked among his people, or reviewed his troops, or gave speeches from the royal balcony, even when his signature was required for critical decisions. It often arrived late, scrawled in an elegant, unhurried hand, passed through intermediaries who had long since stopped asking questions. To his ministers, Ludwig had become unreachable. To Ludwig, the world had become unbearable. At first, they waited. Bavaria had always been proud of its eccentric rulers. The people remembered his father's solitary walks, his grandfather's strict moral codes. A dreamy young king was not, in itself, a crisis. The court whispered that Ludwig would settle in time, that his youthful melancholy would lift, that his costly passions would give way to practical concerns. They spoke of his retreat as a phase, a season, a long sigh of mourning after his father's sudden death. But the seasons turned, and Ludwig did not. Instead of withdrawing from his visions, he built them higher. Neuschwanstein rose like a frozen opera above the clouds. Linderhof gleamed in lonely candlelight. Herrenchiemsee sprawled across its island like a golden echo of a vanished age. He poured millions of marks into architectural dreams. He borrowed from banks, mortgaged his personal estates, issued IOUs under his name. The ministers grew alarmed. The debt mounted. The projects spiraled. Still, Ludwig gave no explanation. He offered no justification, no appeal. In his rare letters to the cabinet, he wrote only of beauty, music, mythology. He believed, with quiet conviction, that his role was not to expand territory or win battles, but to protect the sacred, to build spaces of silence, reverence, and splendor in a world that no longer remembered such things. "I must be allowed to dream," he once wrote, "for that is the only way I know how to live." But his ministers did not want a dreamer. They wanted a king. And Ludwig, wandering through painted corridors and Wagnerian shadows, had become something else entirely. By the spring of 1886, the court reached its breaking point. Secret meetings were held in Munich behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Led by Prime Minister Johann von Lutz and supported by Prince Luitpold, Ludwig's uncle, the cabinet initiated a quiet but irrevocable course of action. If Ludwig could not be reached, he would be removed. They gathered evidence. They reviewed every record, the unpaid debts, the missing reports, the long absences, the lavish requests. They called upon physicians. But there was no examination, no interview, no visit to the king himself. Instead, 4 doctors, relying on hearsay, servant testimony, and personal opinion, signed a document that would end Ludwig's reign. He was declared insane. The diagnosis, incurable paranoia with delusions of grandeur, came wrapped in formality, but it was built on shadows. Ludwig had never been violent. He had harmed no one. He had committed no crime, but he had become inconvenient, unpredictable, unmanageable, and, perhaps, worst of all, he had ceased to care about the world that so desperately wanted to manage him. The decision was sealed in silence. There were no public debates, no press announcements, only letters passed in secret, wax-sealed and hand-delivered. The ministers feared popular backlash, for despite his isolation, Ludwig was still beloved by many common people, admired his devotion to art, his rejection of pomp, his castles that seemed born from dreams. But within the court, a new narrative had taken hold. The king was no longer eccentric. He was dangerous. Bavaria must be protected. The monarchy must be preserved. On the night of June 10th, 1886, a party of officials and doctors, escorted by armed guards, travelled to Neuschwanstein under the cover of darkness. It was a journey both clandestine and momentous, for it would be the last time Ludwig would see the place he had poured his soul into. Mist clung to the cliffs. Rain fell in a soft whisper across the valley. Inside, the king sat alone by a high window, watching the shadows drift across the mountains. He was not warned. He was not consulted. When the door opened and the men entered, cloaked, solemn, prepared for resistance, Ludwig looked at them, not with outrage, but with a calm, distant understanding. He did not fight. He did not protest. He simply listened, his face unreadable. Perhaps in some quiet part of his soul, he had always known this day would come, that the world of order and budgets would one day rise against the kingdom of silence he had built. They told him he must come with them, that he was ill, that he would be cared for, and Ludwig went. He was taken from Neuschwanstein that night, not in chains, not with force, but with a quiet gravity, like a man descending into exile. The castle, still unfinished, remained behind like an open wound, its towers catching the moonlight as the royal carriage vanished into the trees. Imprisoned at Berg. Ludwig was brought to Berg Castle, a lakeside villa on the edge of Lake Starnberg, less than 30 kilometers from Munich. It had once been a pleasant royal retreat. Now it became something else, a gilded prison wrapped in gardens and silence. He was not allowed visitors without supervision. He could not leave the grounds. Doctors and attendants watched him, noting his movements, his moods, his meals. Reports from this time describe Ludwig as quiet, cooperative, withdrawn. He walked alone. He sat for hours by the lake. He said very little. He did not ask about his removal. He did not plead for reinstatement. He had, it seemed, accepted the end of his reign. But no one could say what thoughts moved behind those blue eyes. No one could see the world that still lived within him. The inner kingdom where swan nights still drifted and chandeliers still burned in endless reflection. He wrote no final words. He made no dramatic gestures. His silence grew heavier, but it did not break. Until the evening of June 13th, 1886, the last walk. It was a Sunday, and the light lingered long on the water. Ludwig requested a walk along the lake with his attending physician, Dr. Bernhard von Guden, the same man who had signed his diagnosis. No guards were summoned to accompany them. The two men descended the steps of the castle around 6:30 p.m., disappearing into the soft silver haze of evening. The sun dipped behind the trees. A breeze stirred the surface of the lake. And then, silence. They did not return. An hour passed, then 2. The castle lamps were lit. Servants grew uneasy. A search was organized. At dawn, near the reeds by the lake's edge, 2 bodies were found. Ludwig lay face up in the shallow water, his eyes open to the morning sky. Dr. Guden lay several feet away, his body bruised, his hat missing, his face marked by signs of a struggle. The lake was calm. The night had been still. There had been no storm. No witness, no answer. The official report declared drowning, but the depth of the water was no more than waist high. Ludwig, an excellent swimmer, showed no signs of water in his lungs. His face was untouched. Guden, by contrast, showed signs of violence. From the moment the news reached Munich, speculation bloomed like fog across the city. Some claimed Ludwig had killed Guden in a fit of madness, then drowned himself in remorse. Others believed he had attempted to escape, and Guden had tried to stop him. Still others believed neither man drowned, and that both were murdered, silenced by political hands that feared the king might reclaim his voice. There were no autopsies, no investigation. The mystery was sealed beneath layers of silence and ceremony. On June 19th, Ludwig was buried in the crypt of St. Michael's Church in Munich. Thousands came to see the procession. Some wept openly, Others watched in reverent silence. A few brought flowers. A few whispered prayers. In the streets, crowds gathered, not in protest, but in something closer to mourning for a man they had never fully known. A man who had dreamed too deeply. A king who had vanished into his own fairy tale. The echo that remains. In the years that followed, his castles remained. At first, they were closed, too costly, too strange, too tied to scandal. But soon they were opened to the public, if only to help pay off the massive debts Ludwig had left behind. And then, something unexpected happened. People came. At first, a few, then more, and then many. They came to Neuschwanstein, rising like a white flame above the hills. They walked the mirrored halls of Linderhof, where the candles still burned. They crossed the lake to Herrenchiemsee, where sunlight still spilled through golden corridors. They did not come to see a ruler. They came to feel what he had felt, to glimpse what he had glimpsed, a world more beautiful than the one they knew, a world still dreaming. And so, the man they had once called mad became something else. He became a symbol, a question, a ghost, a soul who had given everything, power, name, legacy, in pursuit of a kingdom that could never be conquered, only imagined. Even now, visitors pause in the courtyards of his castles. They tilt their heads to listen. They touch the cold stone walls. And in that hush, they sense something still alive. Not memory exactly, but presence. As if the king had only just left the room. As if the dream still lingers. And perhaps in some distant hall of light and music, he walks still, a solitary figure in velvet, listening for the next note, the next star, the next turning of the dream. He was not a ruler in the ordinary sense. He was something rarer, a man who chose wonder over rule, and who, in doing so, lost everything, except the soul of his story. And in that story he remains, waiting, wandering, unforgotten. Epilogue. Morning broke over the still waters of Lake Starnberg, and the mist lingered longer than usual that day. It curled across the surface like a veil of breath, silver and slow, as if the lake itself could not bear to stir. The reeds stood motionless. The trees held their silence. Even the birds seemed unsure of what the morning meant. And the king was gone. No trumpet announced it. No proclamations echoed through the squares of Munich. There were no flags lowered, no parades halted, no crowds assembled in mourning. The news did not arrive with thunder, but with a hush. A quiet rumor passed from house to house, village to village, like a breath held too long. In the cities, disbelief and confusion swirled. Had he died? Had he fled? Was it true? Could it be? Some refused to believe it. Others whispered that he had slipped away into one of his castles, vanishing into the mists he had always loved. There were those who claimed he had never truly existed at all, that Ludwig had always been more legend than man. In the government halls of Munich there was a different kind of silence, a silence of relief, though no one dared say it aloud. Papers were filed. Ministers resumed their work. Budgets were recalculated. His debts, vast and shimmering, now belonged to the state. A burden passed from dreamer to accountants. But in the countryside, where the rhythm of life was gentler and closer to the earth, there was only stillness. And in the mountains, in those deep, ancient places where Ludwig's castles pierced the sky and whispered stories into the trees, something shifted. People stopped what they were doing. They looked up toward the high towers, toward Neuschwanstein's pale spires cutting through the clouds, toward Linderhof's hidden valley of fountains and snow-laced pine, toward the distant island where Herrenchiemsee lay like a golden secret across the water. They looked, they listened, and though they said little, they knew. Something had passed, something had ended, and something, though no one could name it, had been left behind. Ludwig had vanished from the world, but what he created did not vanish with him. A silence that did not fade. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, they did not collapse. They did not become overgrown ruins or footnotes in royal archives. They remained exactly as he had dreamed them, solemn, silent, waiting. The torches were no longer lit. The gondolas no longer drifted through artificial caves. The chandeliers no longer flickered over the velvet-draped tables. But still, the spaces did not feel abandoned. They felt paused. At first, the castles were locked. The state, inheriting the aftermath of Ludwig's vision, didn't know what to do with them. Some officials argued they should be dismantled. Symbols, they said, of waste and delusion. Others wanted to turn them into state properties, educational monuments, displays of failed leadership. There were calls to auction their contents, to recover whatever wealth might still be extracted. But none of that came to pass. The buildings themselves resisted such endings. Even in silence, they possessed an authority that could not be erased. Even unopened, they summoned attention. And quietly, slowly, people began to come. Not officials, not scholars, not kings or counts or diplomats, ordinary people. They came first out of curiosity, then out of wonder, then out of something deeper, a need they couldn't quite name. They approached the castle paths with reverence. They stood at locked gates, gazing up at stone towers wrapped in mist. They pressed their hands to the cool walls. They peered through windows into gilded rooms built for no one. And then they returned home, carrying stories not of politics, but of feeling. Eventually, the gates were opened. Not with celebration, but with quiet practicality. Bavaria was still in debt. The castles, left unfinished or unused, could serve a purpose after all admission fees were set. Guided tours were arranged, rooms were dusted, curtains drawn, guards became docents. And the dream, Ludwig's private, aching dream, became a destination, the kingdom after the king. They came in ones and twos, then in lines, then in crowds. They came from nearby villages and far-off countries. They came in coats and hats, in silence and awe, tourists, travellers, artists, lovers, students with notebooks, painters with watercolours, musicians who brought violins to play beneath the trees. They walked the same forest trails Ludwig had walked alone. They paused in the throne room of Neuschwanstein, looking up into a ceiling painted like heaven, with no throne to be found. They passed through the mirrored hall at Herrenchiemsee, watching their reflections repeat like music through space. They strolled the gardens of Linderhof, where the air smelled of pine and rosewater, and the fountains still danced in perfect rhythm. And as they moved through these places, something softened. They lowered their voices. They removed their hats. They stepped more gently. No one told them to. The rooms themselves asked for it. Even children grew quiet there. Because what Ludwig had built was not simply architecture. It was atmosphere, not just design, but devotion. Not just art, but memory. Not of something that had happened, but of something that was always meant to be. He had not built for visitors. He had built for stillness. And yet, every visitor, whether they realized it or not, became part of the story, the enduring dream. Today, Ludwig's castles are among the most visited in the world. Neuschwanstein alone draws over 1 million visitors each year. It has appeared in films, books, photographs, advertisements. It inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. It is printed on puzzles and postcards, on posters and snow globes. But none of that is the castle. The real castle is not in the picture. It is in the silence. It is in the moment someone enters a candlelit room, stops, and suddenly feels that they've crossed into something larger, softer, stranger, that they have stepped inside a dream not their own, but one they have always recognized. Because what Ludwig created was not merely beautiful, it was sacred. And it was not the kind of sacredness that demands worship. It was the kind that invites quiet. It was the kind that wraps around you gently and reminds you, without speaking, that you once believed in things you cannot name. That beauty, pursued for its own sake, can be a kind of prayer. The king becomes a presence. He is still called many things. The Mad King, the Swan King, the Dreamer King, the Fairytale King. Each name says something, but none of them says enough. They try to contain him in language, to explain him in terms history can manage. But Ludwig does not live there. He lives in the flicker of candlelight across polished mirrors, in the painted sky of a throne room with no throne, in the moment when a visitor walks into a chamber and forgets the world outside. He does not haunt his castles. He inhabits them, not as a ghost, but as a presence, a hush, a breath, a pause between heartbeats. He walks through golden halls in silence. He glides across underground lakes in golden boats. He stands at windows as the mist curls through pine trees, listening for the music that has always been there, just beyond hearing. He is in every detail built not for ceremony, but for solitude. In every curtain drawn not to block light, but to frame it. In every note of music that plays softly from hidden speakers, echoing through corridors where no orchestra ever stood. The legacy of silence. Ludwig did not win battles. He did not expand borders. He did not sit long in council or pass sweeping reforms, but his legacy remains, not in law, but in longing. He left behind no heirs, only echoes. He built nothing for power, everything for peace, and he paid for it with his name, his throne, and his place in the world. But what he created has outlasted all of it. And so, if you climb the winding paths to Neuschwanstein, or trace the marble paths of Linderhof's gardens, or ride the slow boat across Chiemsey's still waters, listen closely. Do not look only for the king. Look for the silence, the way it waits beneath the arches, the way it breathes through the hallways, the way it leans gently against the stone. And when you feel it, that hush, that presence, that impossible peace, you'll know the dream never ended. It only changed hands, and Ludwig, king, dreamer, builder of impossible beauty, walks within it still. Thank you for joining me tonight. If this story brought you a sense of stillness, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Morpheus by Starlight, where quiet voices and gentle journeys wait for you whenever you need rest. Feel free to share where you're listening from. It's a quiet comfort to know we're not alone beneath the stars. And now, as the last echoes fade, may sleep find you softly, and may you dream well. Good night.